So I'm here with Shankar Singham and Alden Abbott to discuss their new book, Trade, Competition, and Domestic Regulatory Policy. Really exciting book, great timing for it as we are, trying to figure out how to get along in this interconnected global commerce world with a lot of different players. And this book is for me, it was a really great chance just to sort of reset, take a breath, and kind of go back to the basics on competition, within the border and across the border. And it also was really nice in that sense that it drew lines between this substantive framework and real problems that we're all seeing now. So I'd like to ask you guys, why did you write the book?
Why did we write it? Well, I think we were trying to solve, as you said, a problem in the world. The problem in trade was that we had trade rules and trade agreements and so on that dealt very well with border barriers and border problems, but didn't really deal with competition behind the border and how would we make markets actually competitive. And so we were seeing lots of traders who would have market access, but they wouldn't be able to succeed in the market because of all these barriers that were inside the border. And then we had effects of, in big economies like China and so on, things that were happening inside the border, distortions, what we've called anti-competitive market distortions, that were happening inside the border that had trade effects. And they weren't being dealt with either in the global sort of economic architecture. So the question for us was, how can we improve the trade world to take into account these distortions? And how could we improve or interconnect the competition world so that it could also offer solutions to these problems?
Yes, thanks, Shankar. We are concerned because there's a lot of prosperity being left on the table. What people forget in these times is that after World War II, people got a lot richer. Hundreds of millions of people came out of poverty. Average incomes rose up into the 20th century, and that large part of that was lowering tariffs, make it easier for people in each country to sell all around the world. But there were limitations to that. Just lowering tariffs, you get rid of tariffs, and there is lots being left on the table because there are lots of ways in which you can get more benefits to consumers, better quality products, better supply chains, all of that. Why aren't they working as well as they should? Because government often gives special interest protection to certain firms, lots of lobbying, but in general, government regulates to make some firms have higher costs than other firms. The higher cost firms can't compete, even although they would like to, and these sorts of restrictions often hit firms engaging in foreign investment or imports and exports. So lots of companies would like to compete, for example, in the United States or Europe, but can't because rules in those countries make it much harder for these new companies to enter. People who start small businesses in the United States, Europe, so on, they're limited in their ability often to penetrate new markets. Not because of technology, we've got the internet, not because they can't get their word out, but because local rules, special rules, make it very, very hard for them to sell, whether extensive red tape or rules that limit the number of companies that can sell into a market, that sort of thing. And to deal with this sort of problem, if we could deal with this sort of problem comprehensively, a lot of people who are poor, but he pulled out of poverty, lots of small businesses, other average consumers would have more money to do with what they want, more freedom to grow their families and better their own circumstances. So this isn't magic. This is just getting rid of unnecessary rules and trying to come up with a framework that gives governance incentives to do this, to make it easier, to do away with the restrictions, which would make people in societies around the world better off.
So what are some of the more salient distortions, Shankar? I mean, things that are some of the low-hanging fruit right now within the UK, and then also, say, better US-UK trading alliances?
Well, we looked at three sort of fundamental pillars that if you get these right, then you're going to liberate prosperity and you're going to create much better conditions for people in the world. And those are, how open is your trading system? How competitive is your market? I mean, as Alden just said, can you get a situation where I want to sell something to somebody who wants to buy it, and there's as little in the way of us, in between us, as possible. So we've minimized the distance between us. And when the government distorts markets in these distorting ways, that tends to put further distance between the buyer of a product and the seller, and we want to get them closer together. And that's when prosperity is going to be generated. And the final sort of third area is property rights, and ensuring that, because property rights are what firms compete with. So if you have weak disciplines on property rights, you don't get that competition. It doesn't liberate those economic gains. So we look at those three different pillars and we try to sort of maximize them, because if they're maximized, then prosperity gains are greatest for people around the world. So what are the things that get in the way of those things? Well, obviously trade barriers that prevent buyers and sellers who are in different countries from coming together, and then within the market, Alden talked about rules that limit the number of companies that are allowed to compete. There might be rules that make it very expensive to run a business, and that increased cost causes firms to exit the market, and that leaves only a handful of firms that can then dominate the market. And when they dominate the market, they will increase the price. And so ultimately what we're primarily concerned about is the plight of the consumer. You know, what's happening to the consumer as a result of all of these processes that are going on around them, and are we damaging consumers' interests by distorting markets in these ways? And quite often, the government will say that they're doing this particular thing to help people. I mean, these things are always dressed up as they're designed to help people, but they end up harming the consumer more than they are helping. And they quite often help very powerful companies that have very privileged positions in markets. They're very big and they don't want other companies to compete against them. And quite often a lot of the government distortions are beneficial to that class of company.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I loved the chapters on patent protection, intellectual property right regimes. You know, and it was a stark reminder to me that, you know, this notion today that stronger patents are really just protecting the larger firms, but the book really reminds us that it's actually strong patent rights that help the smaller individual innovators and smaller firms, isn't it?
That's quite right. Yes, there's lots of evidence. Small inventors, often they don't have a wherewithal to run a big company or create infrastructure, but they've got the great idea and they want to be able to protect that idea and sell that idea to companies that can implement it. And investment goes to small innovators like that. If they have the talent and they can be spotted, they often have specialized learning and so on, and they will get the support to get those patents and to start companies. And those companies hopefully sometimes can be sold or can license, let others use their new technologies for a price. But where patents are thought of as monopolies, when government doesn't enforce them, these people come up with a great invention and get stolen by somebody else. Somebody else copies it. You can't afford to bring a lawsuit to stop them. And what does that mean? It means that the money that was used to help these companies, the people are not going to invest in new ideas and new companies if you can't protect the ideas that they put into technology. And this is the real issue. I mean, think of, there are many inventions. For instance, the patents developed a technology that was used for COVID vaccines, and not just COVID vaccines, for experimental anti-cancer vaccines, for great drugs. Now there's a lot of talk about put price caps on everything, lower the price of everything, consumers will be better off. Well, they really won't, because in the short run, if you artificially lower price or don't enforce patents, then you'll have less innovation. That means fewer people will get cancer cures, fewer people will benefit from new and better technologies. So that's why it sounds sort of fancy, but that's why talking about property rights protection is really very important to bringing benefits to consumers and to the public in general.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. The property rights is the fundamental in the book. It's the fundamental right on which the rest of the structure is built. So firms compete with their property. If you don't protect their property, they have nothing to compete with, and none of the benefits of competition are going to accrue to the market, to the country. But it's very important that the intellectual property right is understood as a property right. I mean, quite often people will say, "Oh, well, we're as Alden just mentioned, we're giving you a monopoly in order because we want to stimulate innovation." For example, the patent will often be described in that way, and that's not the right way to look at it. There was a case that we talk about in the book on property rights involving a collection of islands off the coast of, I think, Denmark, the Spitsbergen archipelago, and there were no rights in this. There's no government in this place. And eventually miners came and they found valuable things, and the question was, well, who did this belong to? Was it the miner who had worked to get the things out of the earth, or who was it? And if your vision is that the intellectual property right is a right that's conferred by the government, in other words, it's a government monopoly, government granted monopoly, then in that particular case, there was no government. There was no government to grant anything. If, on the other hand, you think it accrues as a natural right by the hard work of the person who's made this discovery, then the government can't take that away. So we argue that the intellectual property right is actually a property right, and it is permissible to talk about the length of time of the right. Do you give a patent for 20 years? Do you give a patent for 10 years? I mean, changing the amount of time, that's a sort of permissible exercise. But what you can't do is sort of unbundle the value of the rights. In the same way that you can't say, if you buy a television, somebody doesn't say to you, well, you can watch the television between 2 o'clock in the morning and 4 o'clock in the morning, but you can't watch it between 1 o'clock in the afternoon and 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Well, quite often, that kind of approach to the intellectual property right is exactly what governments are sort of seeking to do. We see, Alden mentioned the technology that gave rise to the COVID vaccine. Well, there's an active discussion going on in the WTO now about waiving some of these intellectual property rights. Again, the argument being, it's always for a good, quotes, a good reason. The argument is, well, we need to get this stuff out to people in the world. The problem is that when you do that, that sort of approach only works if we've discovered everything already, if we are basically at the end of technological innovation. If in fact we're not, and when the mRNA technology was invented, nobody was thinking about COVID. Nobody knew that this was going to be a valuable use of the mRNA technology in the future. So we're not anywhere near the end of technological innovation. One can make an argument we've barely started, and therefore it's very important to ensure that innovation can occur. And innovation occurs best when you protect the property rights of the inventors, and when you allow competition to prevail. And competition meaning getting the barriers between the buyer and the seller out of the equation, so they're able to interact through voluntary exchange.
Yeah.
And I'll just mention the growth in innovation. A number of book studies in the United States really stems from the U.S. Constitution saying patents are a protected right, and that stimulated in the 1800s, I think, from the growth of the railroads, electricity, the electric light, and the 20th century aviation, and more recently, everything from the new pharmaceuticals, so-called biologicals, more advanced semiconductors. This stuff, which we benefit from, people say, well, the internet should be free. That's fine, but many things on which the internet is based, the pillars, transmission technologies, all that, comes from people being able to protect their innovations. And if we hadn't protected these innovations so well, we'd all be a lot poorer right now. More people would be dying of diseases. You'd have you wouldn't have the instantaneous transmission of information that allows or contact with our friends and relatives all around the world. Those things really were enabled by protection of property, and that's what we try to drive home.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for writing this book. And like I said, I'm really looking forward to reading the rest of it. It's a book that you want on your bookshelf, to bring together the way you guys have done, the international trade, domestic economic regulatory policy, and patent rights is so important today when we're trying to figure out how to get along with a lot of other different countries with different ways of doing things. Kind of brings us back to the basics. So thank you both for writing it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.